Hello and welcome to Living Proof, the joint podcast of plus.maths.org and the Isaac Newton Institute in Cambridge. I'm Marianne Freiberger.
And I'm Sarah Khan. Every now and again, and more often than you think, the world of mathematics overlaps with the world of theatre and film. And this is something that happened recently when I organized staging of the play Diving into Maths with Emmy Noether, which was a part of our Modern History of Mathematics research program and also the Inclusivity in Mathematical Sciences workshop. You can hear participants of these in the background during the interview that we're going to hear in a moment. So Marianne, do you want to tell us a little bit about the audience and the cast and production of the play?
Okay, so the play, as you said, is called Diving into Math with Emmy Noether. It is by Portrait Theater from Vienna in cooperation with the Freie Universität Berlin. The director is Sandra Schüttekopf. The lead actress is Anita Zier. And the scientific board, who gave advice on the maths and the science in it, consists of Mechthild Koruba and David E. Rowe.
How exciting. So what can you tell us about Emmy Noether? Who was she?
Okay, so Emmy Noether was a mathematician. She lived from 1882 to 1935. And her main body of work was in algebra. So that's pure mathematics. That's looking at very, very abstract structures. But later in life, and not so many people know that, she actually also delved into number theory, which again is like a really pure area of mathematics. However, and perhaps what she's most known for, is that one of her results had applications in physics. At the time, Albert Einstein was busy developing his general theory of relativity, and it is in general relativity that Noether's work found applications. And what happened was that one of her results related symmetries to conservation laws in physics. So many people will have heard of conservation of energy, which is like a fundamental law of physics. So energy is always conserved. So if I were to kick a football, then the kinetic energy in my foot after kicking wouldn't disappear; it would go into the ball. So energy is always conserved. And Noether, kind of amazingly, related this to certain symmetries in space. To find out more about this, you can go to plus.maths.org. We'll put a link in the show notes where you can read more about this famous result that Noether proved. Now, Einstein actually called her a creative mathematical genius, which is quite a compliment to get from somebody like Albert Einstein. But she also faced huge challenges being a woman mathematician. In fact, there was a lot of protest against her habilitating. So habilitation is essentially becoming a professor with tenure. That was in Germany. And there's a kind of quite a funny anecdote about this, because one of the people who did support her was the famous mathematician David Hilbert. And when people protested against her habilitating because she was a woman, Hilbert supposedly said, well, this is not a bathhouse, meaning we do not need to separate men from women in mathematics, which is kind of quite funny. But so she had to face quite a lot of resistance there. And also she had to flee Germany from the Nazis. She went to the US. And sadly, she died quite young, aged 53, after an operation.
She was definitely an interesting person. Our colleague Rachel Thomas got a chance to interview David Rowe, who was on the scientific board of the play. David is a historian of mathematics who specializes in mathematics at Göttingen. It was a German university that was very influential at the time that Emmy Noether worked there. He told Rachel some fascinating things about Noether and her generous and collaborative approach to maths. Let's hear it directly from David and Rachel.
The play is something that grew out of a conference that involved women in mathematics, but also involved the three universities in Berlin, Math Plus cluster groups that had, they were celebrating the founding of that at the time in 2019. And Mechthild Koruba, who's an expert on Emmy Noether, and happened to be also the chief gender officer at the Free University in Berlin, got the brilliant idea that why don't we celebrate this event about women in mathematics by commemorating the lecture that Emmy Noether gave 100 years ago to become habilitated to be able to teach at a German university. So the play, that's central to the play itself and the career of Emmy Noether. Many, many other things in the play, but I would say that was the original idea, and they placed that within the context of her biography.
And you've done a lot of research on Emmy Noether and on her mathematics and her place in the history of maths. Why is she a good person to be commemorated in this way?
Well, one of the things, I mean, Mechthild and I didn't do more than provide them with background information and so forth. They had only 8 or 9 months to produce a play for that event. It had to be performed on the date of the 100th anniversary. We didn't really know what to expect. We were sitting in the front row, very nervous and wondering, huge crowd of people. And of course, one of the things about the play that's unusual is it uses video and music and various multimedia effects. And through that device, they were able to bring 4 other close, eminent mathematicians who were close friends or students or collaborators of Emmy Noether in view. And so you get not just Emmy, she's on stage, but you get little pieces of a connection she made with very important mathematicians in 4 different areas. And so you get an idea of her influence. I mean, that's very hard to convey, of course. If I just talk about it now, well, then it takes a long time, and they do it very vividly because they're connected with all these actors in Vienna. I mean, they come from Vienna, which is a huge, huge place to be doing theater. And so they contacted 4 of their colleagues who performed little cameo pieces that were filmed and embedded into the play. And I think that makes it particularly effective. I thought the play was very evocative of what I've heard from interviewing research mathematicians over the years, that mathematics is this collaborative pursuit. It's a creative pursuit, and your collaborators are so important. But also, it gave a sense of how Noether was part of a community, and how elements of that community really stood up for her and helped her succeed in a time when women, were not supposed to be part of the mathematics community. So I thought it was really interesting to see a piece of theatre about a mathematician and the way they worked, because it told that human story and that aspect to being a mathematician that you don't always get from learning about the mathematics. Absolutely. I said it very well. And I think the other point that I would emphasize is that that's new. That wasn't always the case. If you go back to the 19th century, you'll hardly ever find papers that are written by more than one author. Collaboration is a brand new thing. It happened somewhere, and the place it first happened was Göttingen. I didn't realize that. So before Göttingen and that era, mathematics was more of a solitary pursuit. Absolutely. And what was it about Göttingen and that time that enabled collaboration to be a part of mathematics? Well, it's kind of hard to boil that down because it takes place in stages and so forth. So there are various people, but in the play itself, when she first comes, and of course, you could say she was lucky there was a First World War. That was, she gets invited by Klein and Hilbert to come, and they want her to habilitate and so forth. They know about how brilliant she is, but the idea of a woman habilitating, even for them, this was kind of, it wasn't on their radar screen that much. It was not institutionally possible, actually. And so it had to do with circumstances Emmy Noether's father being a famous mathematician, so she's kind of a known entity on a certain level. But bringing her in was step one, and of course they had already created, and this would keep expanding this sort of communal aspect. But somehow there was something about her personality and her ability to draw people in. It was a fairly, intimate group. Courant had a much bigger group and so forth, but they were interested in publishing a lot, and the things we think of today, publish or perish, this type of. Emmy Noether, no, she was not like that. She was much more generous in her approach to other people, and she had her antennae out all the time. She went to meetings all the time, connecting with people. Very, very social person, and so she brought in new mathematics, abstract mathematics that wasn't there before, and she excited a lot of people, and that made it Göttingen a very exciting place for that group anyway, who were into that.
And she had to leave Göttingen in the 1930s because of the rise of Hitler, and she was a Jewish mathematician. Did she manage to continue having that impact in the short time she was? Did she leave an impact there, and did she have an impact on that collaborative nature of mathematics after she left?
Well, unfortunately, she died young. So she died unexpectedly after an operation in 1935. So she's actually only in the United States for less than 2 years. And that time period was a difficult transition time for everybody, of course, depression. But of course, by that time, she had a great deal of support from very, very high-level people in the play. The names are thrown out, not only Klein and Hilbert, who are, old by that time, but Hermann Weyl, who was in Princeton at that point. Albert Einstein knew her. And, that was, she had a lot of support. And so the idea of bringing her over, and then the deal was she taught at a very high-level women's college, and they actually didn't give her regular classes to teach. She had her own little postdocs. So they brought in some young women who had already taken their doctorates. She had one doctoral student, but the others were all postdocs. And Olga Tauski was in the play, and she was one of those postdocs. And the idea was, learning really high-level mathematics and then go down to Princeton, to the Institute for Advanced Studies. So she would lecture on Monday, take some of her girls with her, go down on the train to Princeton, and then give a lecture to the boys.
So there were no women at Princeton at the time?
At the university, that's correct, and that was mentioned in the play. But she was at the Institute for Advanced Studies, so that was no problem. They were in the same building back then, actually, so...
And so she had an important part perhaps in the culture of mathematics, both as being one of the first female mathematicians who managed to have the rules at that point just an exemption rather than necessarily a full change, that women could be an active participant and recognised as such. But also she had a big impact on the mathematics itself. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
I can try. Some things that fit into it. The first person who appears in a cameo role, Bartel van der Werden, a student from Amsterdam. He was doing algebraic geometry at the time, but of course he's at the time very much remembered for the textbook he wrote, Modern Algebra, which she made fun of a little bit in the play by saying it's no longer modern. but of course it was the leading entree text for people learning structures of algebra. Jean Dieudonné, when he was a key figure for Bourbaki, and this opened his eyes, and so there's a pretty smooth transition there between the type of mathematics Emmy Noether did and Bourbaki, the very huge movement and so forth. and all over Western world, I guess certainly in the United States and elsewhere, this type of structure-oriented, abstract structures approach to mathematics that she excelled in and it was remembered for, that really took off.
And so she taught the author of that famous textbook.
Yes, he was in her courses. He was off and on in Göttingen. He later habilitated in Göttingen, and he was also a very broad mathematician. I think personally they hit it off very well. He had other interests she didn't maybe have, but that was typical of Emmy Noether. I mean, Emmy Noether was a pure algebraist in her mature years who transitioned into number theory. And so she was doing class field theory with Helmut Hasse at the end of her career. That is something a lot of people don't know so much about, that she actually was able to move into a very classical part of number theory, but then approach it on a very high abstract level.
And one of the things, if you know about Emmy Noether outside of mathematics, a lot of people actually know about her because of a result she proved, which had a big impact in physics, which Noether's theorem about linking symmetries in the physical world to conservation laws. How did that come about, that piece of work?
So when she first came to Göttingen in 1915, that was right at the time that Einstein came to deliver lectures on general relativity, and she certainly attended those. Physics wasn't her background, but Hilbert became very excited about the mathematical principles and the physical ideas too that Einstein had trotted out. And this was a very critical stage in general relativity because he hadn't yet attained the final field equations he was trying to get. So there's a lot of excitement in the air about that. And she's like working with Hilbert, who wants assistance of the type she can offer because she's an expert on invariant theory and differential invariance and things like that. So as part of a research program, you'd say, is how it started. And then it kind of moved on to a different phase where Klein then becomes, he's kind of mopping up, you might say. Hilbert has kind of moved on to other things. And there are many open issues. A lot of things weren't clear at all. And she knew this stuff by then very, very well. So they start working together. And out of that collaboration, you'd call it, I guess, emerges her famous paper, Invariant Variational Problems. Yeah, it's quite a lot of complicated mathematics, but it's pure mathematics actually, and often it was treated by mathematicians as a contribution to the calculus of variations independent of physics. I mean, she mentions the background and the motivation was obviously physical. What's the difference between special relativity and general relativity? But it was one of these papers that sat around and people occasionally cited it. She didn't make a big deal of it or anything. She acted like, well, this is just such and such, I'm just generalizing, what other people had done. And that was kind of the way she was. She never made a big deal of her work. And then later physicists decided, this is really the most elegant way to look at this stuff. So particle physicists and so forth. I was astounded, actually, when I got involved in this play, that it seemed as if the physicists were more interested in having Emmy Noether than the mathematicians. I mean, a lot of the stuff in mathematics that she did, and that's in the play also, it's so embedded in mathematics that people don't necessarily make a big deal of any of that stuff. It's just, that's just bread and butter for people in graduate school in mathematics.
So fundamental, the work.
Yeah, she did fundamental work. I mean, that you have to go back in time to understand how important and new it was. it was, of course, not brand new. It was building on other things, but she just took it to this abstract level where all of a sudden you understand these different things in algebra. And that's not presented, of course, in textbooks. I mean, you just go to the top, and then it becomes, after van der Waerden, sort of standard stuff everybody learns. And Emmy Noether is known maybe for this and that. I mean, in the end, in the play, you get all those nice placards with all the things named after her. But that was a very smart move on their part. They didn't want to neglect this altogether. But no, I'm not going to talk about mathematics. And in the end, she trots these things.
She stands in a field of all these placards, which are all named after her, all these aspects of
her
mathematics.
Her world.
Her
right?
Noether space,
Noether space, yes.
And I wanted to ask you about researching the history of mathematics. What can that bring to the study of mathematics? Like, I find it fascinating to find out about the people who create the mathematics and the context they created it in. Because, as you said, in a textbook, you just see the top level, the finished product, where actually understanding where it came from can be really helpful even in understanding the mathematics itself. What do you think in terms of what history of maths can bring to mathematics?
Well, I'm very glad you asked this, and it comes right to the point, I think. There are the things, biographical things that people are interested in and so forth, but the other part of it is, and this is really very badly neglected often in mathematics. I mean, when I think about my own graduate school education, I simply was totally unequipped to learn anything about older mathematics. I mean, I was starting from zero. And I had to unlearn things because you couldn't read these things if you projected back from what you knew. Better not to know anything. I think the key thing here is that for, say, a younger person, not that many people are going to go into researching the history of mathematics on a deep level. But what they can appreciate, I think, as mathematicians is the process. As you said, you're getting the final end product, and that's always the case, and that should be that way. You want to know what are the main results, where are we in these different fields, and so forth. But the process of getting there is often very long and torturous and so forth, and isn't appetizing for most mathematicians to know too much about that, but just to be aware of it, and this communal aspect, of course, makes it much easier, because then you understand it's very much a human activity, etc. Going back in time, that was not the case, and yet nevertheless there had to be a process preceding the final products as such.
And I always enjoy being able to present mathematics as a human creation, and that it's and Emmy Noether in the play talks about it's a creative act doing mathematics, which I think is so important to get across. I must ask, how did you get involved in the play, and what was your role?
Well, they're starting from scratch, so I mean, and the thing is that Emmy Noether never wrote anything about herself. And there's rather little correspondence, and then it's highly technical and so forth. So what do we have to give them? So we met, of course, with Sandra, and I'm sure Mekti had met with her more than I did. I had to come to Berlin and meet and brainstormed and so forth, and gave them various little hints. I mean, I wrote up some stuff that they use for a few scenes and so forth. I mean, I'm basically an expert on mathematics in Göttingen, so that helped. And she gets a little too nostalgic about Göttingen in the play, I think. But they took these things, and but we didn't know what they were gonna make of it. I mean, they really figured out a way to do it and to get at the spirit of Emmy Noether. That was really, of course, vital.
And when I spoke to you before the play last night, you mentioned how one of the aspects you really liked about it was that it was authentic? And does that authenticity come from the fact that they based it on this history material that you could give them from your research as an expert on the history of maths in Göttingen?
Yeah, that's essentially what I meant, that here is a determined effort to try to get a sense of this personality in her time, packaged, of course, with other things, because you have to do that for theater. I mean, that's clear. But nevertheless, many things that are presented that she says come right from texts and so forth. I mean, it's the different anecdotes and stuff like that. It's all grounded. So, of course, that makes the thing authentic in a certain sense that there's a lot going around today about Emmy Noether, and little of it has much substance. I mean, that's, and then it was kind of partly my shtick, too, a bit Mechthild agreed completely as well. Mechthild's an expert on the history of algebra. And we wanted to make it clear she's not a physicist, so that has to be kind of trotted out. The physics is if the physicists like what I do, that's wonderful.
But her heart and her work was in mathematics.
Oh, not only her heart, the heart of her work, her whole orientation was purely mathematical. So she was definitely a pure mathematician.
And you're here as part of the Modern History of Mathematics research program, a longer research program here at the Isaac Newton Institute. What attracts you to coming to a program like this?
Well, this is a fantastic program. So if I had more time, and I'm here for 3 weeks as a special part of it, but this has just been wonderful. And of course, I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to be here. It's the first time I've ever been here, and it's been a great opportunity for the history of mathematics in general that Ulrike Tillmann agreed to have us.
And is there a particular area of work that's being discussed in the program that you're particularly interested in?
Well, I'm kind of running a workshop, actually, because my background was in topology, and so I am part of a small group that is looking at the history of topology, or three manifolds in particular, Poincaré conjecture, etc.
And is it unusual to have the opportunity to bring so many people together to work on something like that?
This is unusual in that it's sort of a revolving door of all kinds of things in the history of mathematics, so it's far, far broader than anything I've ever experienced, certainly.
So that's it for this edition of the Living Proof podcast, produced jointly by the INI and plus.maths.org. We will put the links to some of the things mentioned in this episode.
And if you
in the show
enjoyed
notes.
this episode, then please rate and review us, because it helps other people find the podcast. Thanks very much for listening, and bye for now.